December 12th, 2019. I watched Disney's Maleficent at the theater. It was designed for maybe a 10-year-old girl, but I was the youngest in the mall cinema today. I could make excuses like, I went for the CGI, or I just couldn't pass up Angelina Jolie and Michelle Pfeiffer in the same movie. Fact of the matter is, I was just trying to make myself not go to the sanctuary today. And I could not get my truck in for an oil change till Monday, and it looks like rain, so I was trying to amuse myself without going far. I looked up weird things to do near me, and guess what was top of the list? Yep, big cat rescue. The next options were a dollar store and a taxidermy shop in Ybor City. No and no. So I looked for a matinee, and I will now take out my Maleficent hairdo. In case you were wondering what that was all about. We have been so freaked out over the horrible Congressional Budget Office report after that partner, who will remain unnamed from an organization that will remain unnamed, screwed up the meeting, that I was happy to see Howie break rank and privately send this rebuttal to Max, who is the aide in our bill sponsor's office. Hopefully Max is now armed to have it reevaluated. So I'm going to read parts of the report and then Howie's rebuttal to it. In my diary here, I said, Howie's words are in regular text and the budget is in italics, but you can't see that. So I'm going to call it out. So the report, the CBO report, said, current law prohibits the import, export, purchase, sale, transport, and acquisition of big cats, such as lions and tigers across state lines or the national border. Howie responded, this is not quite accurate. Current laws, the Captive Wildlife Safety Act and the Endangered Species Act, allow transfers between USDA licensees in different states if the transfer is not a sale, if it is a sale, if the seller obtains a captive-bred wildlife permit from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. More on that below. The CBO report said, H.R. 1380 would prohibit the breeding and possession of those animals, although wildlife sanctuaries, veterinarians, colleges and universities, zoos, exhibitions, and other entities that meet certain requirements would be exempt. In addition, people who already own such animals would be permitted to keep them if they register with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Howie's response to the CBO report says, while this does track the bill language, a simpler and easier way to understand the bill is to say that it phases out ownership by people who are not licensed and inspected by USDA, i.e. private or pet owners, and prohibits direct contact for cub petting. To be clear, only people who lack a USDA license are required to register their animals with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and those licensed by USDA do not have to meet some onerous qualifications. All they have to do is not allow public contact, keeping animals who are not in their cages at least 15 feet away from the public. No USDA licensee has to build anything or incur any expense to be exempt, the CBO report said. H.R. 1380 would direct U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to issue regulations to implement the prohibition on breeding and possession. Howie's rebuttal said, the only regulation needed would be to lay out the details of how the people without USDA exhibitor licenses would register the animals one time, i.e., at inception, when the law took effect. This could be done very inexpensively with a simple database, where the owners could provide their information on an online form and perhaps attach a photo of each animal. The CBO report said, in addition, CBO expects that under the bill, the Department of Agriculture would revise existing regulations on the licensings of entities that possess, exhibit, and breed big cats. Based on the cost of similar tasks, CBO estimates that developing these regulations would cost $1 million in 2020. Howie's rebuttal said, USDA currently has one regulation dealing with the handling of animals, 9 CFR 2.131, that contains limitations on how cubs can be handled by the public, such as not treating the animals roughly. Those provisions would be superseded by the bill because it prohibits handling at all by the public. It would seem pointless to go through the usual rulemaking process of notice and comment since this limitations, I think this is a typo. It would seem pointless to go through the rulemaking process of notice and comment since this limitation in this regulation places on contact simply no longer apply since the contact is prohibited. The CBO report said, many states already prohibit ownership of the affected species, and CBO expects that people who currently own such animals would register with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Thus, violations under the bill would probably occur infrequently. On that basis, CBO estimates that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would incur costs of less than $500,000 annually after 2020 to maintain the registry and conduct enforcement. In total, we estimate that implementing H.R. 1380 would cost $3 million over the 2020 to 2024 period. Such spending would be subject to the availability of the appropriated funds. Howie's rebuttal said, agree, enforcement would be inexpensive. No inspection is required, and no undercover work like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does in trafficking cases would be done. Any enforcement would likely be from tips and be straightforward. It is not practical to operate a financially viable cub petting operation like the few that exist today without advertising it because it requires volume to be financially viable, and it does not have a high enough price tag to make operating in a clandestine way profitable. Enforcement would likely be rare enough to not require any additional staffing at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. As the local government level, phasing out unlicensed ownership would result in a savings because a local law enforcement would not have to spend resources and endanger officers responding to escapes or incidents like the Zanesville tragedy, where a private owner let out 56 dangerous animals, including 38 big cats, killed himself, and local deputies had to shoot most of the animals. Also, by eliminating the rampant excess breeding of tiger cubs that is driven by the need for constant supply of cubs to pet, USDA would end up with fewer animals to inspect. Finally, no one knows what happens to the cubs after they are too big to pet. With less breeding, the animals only bred for exhibition, not petting, it is likely that there would be less trafficking for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to enforce. This is the CBO report. Under H.R. 1380, violators would be subject to criminal and civil penalties, which are recorded in the budget as revenues. Some of those penalties can be spent without further appropriation. Thus, enacting the bill could increase revenues and associated direct spending. However, CBO estimates that the net reduction in the deficit would be insignificant over the 2020 to 2029 period. They go on to say, H.R. 1380 contains intergovernmental and private sector mandates as described in the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. CBO estimates that the aggregate cost of the mandates, which would include both lost revenue and additional expenses to comply with the bill's requirements, would exceed the annual threshold established in UMRA, which is the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, for private sector mandates, $164 million in 2019, adjusted annually for inflation. Because little data is available to establish whether public zoos would be able to meet the conditions for exemption from the bill's prohibitions, CBO cannot determine whether the cost would exceed the intergovernmental threshold established in the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, $82 million in 2019, adjusted annually for inflation. Howie's rebuttal said, approximately 360 facilities, both public and private, are licensed by USDA to possess and breed big cats, and an unknown number of private people own big cats as pets. The bill would impose public and private mandates by prohibiting entities and people from possessing and breeding the cats or by requiring them to meet conditions to be exempted from the prohibitions. To qualify for an exemption, exhibitors licensed by USDA would be required to 1. Prohibit public contact with the big cats, 2. Maintain a 15-foot gap between the public and the animals or erect a permanent barrier, and 3. Develop a population management and care plan approved by the USDA, that would allow incidental contact with the animals as part of conservation programs. This characterization of the bill as requiring conditions is not an accurate reflection of how the bill would operate. All zoos already have a permanent barrier referred to in the bill, i.e., the cats are kept in enclosures, or called cages. These cages must meet USDA regulations. No zoo will have to erect a new barrier. If an animal exhibited outside of the enclosure, such as on a leash, only then must the animal be 15 feet from the public for safety. No one is required to have a population management plan. They have the option of having one if they want to have the limited contact allowed in the bill for contact by those assisting in the husbandry that is part of the implementation of such a plan, i.e., not charging for cub petting. The CBO report said, approximately 40 exhibitors, including public zoos, allow physical contact with big cats through seasonal encounters with the animals, and more than 200 exhibitors, mostly privately owned facilities, allow some form of direct contact with big cats during special fundraising events. Further, breeders and trainers provide big cats for movies and documentaries featuring wildlife. All of those activities would be prohibited under the bill. Using information from conservation groups and industry sources, CBO estimates that the income foregone from prohibiting these activities would be about $170 million a year. Howard's rebuttal was, "This is incorrect," and may come from a miscommunication described below regarding sales of cubs. It may be helpful to have a quick understanding of the cub petting industry. There are about half a dozen major operations that have as many as 50 to 100 tigers in breeding pairs that are constantly breeding cubs to use in their petting operation, which, more importantly, is only a part of their business model. There are about 24 or so other zoos who from time to time offer cub petting. They may occasionally have a birth or obtain a cub from one of the other breeders. Prior to 2016 and the rescission of the generic tiger rule by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the breeders could sell a tiger cub to another USDA licensee legally. Since then, it's illegal to sell cubs without obtaining a captive bred wildlife permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It is not possible to obtain a captive wildlife permit for cub petting because it does not enhance the species, a requirement for the permit. All endangered and threatened species require the permit. The only permits I am aware of being issued are to Association of Zoos and Aquariums, AZA zoos, and that sometimes transfer animals among their members for conservation breeding under the Species Survival Plan. None of the 238 zoos accredited by the AZA offer cub petting, and of the roughly 60 zoos in the ZAA, we can only detect 3 that offer cub petting. The other few dozen who are detected online offering cub petting at times are not members of either organization. The approximately 40 exhibitors who at least occasionally offer cub petting is a reasonable statement. However, almost all of the revenue associated with these is not from fundraising events of any kind. It is from fees paid by the public to pet cubs, and none of these zoos have cub petting as their only activity. The statement that there are 200 zoos using cub petting for major fundraising events is simply incorrect. Based on these numbers, 90% or more of zoos operate successfully without cub petting. So clearly, the 10% who offer it as part of their business model could survive successfully without it by simply adopting the same business model the other zoos find successful, i.e., operating a zoo. Replacing promoting cub petting with contact with other species, preferably less dangerous ones, which we already see at many of these zoos, or offering other activities instead of cub petting without a loss in revenue. The CBO report said, the exhibitors unable to meet the criteria for exemption would be unable to replace their cats after the current population dies. Based on information from industry sources, CBO estimates that zoos and other public exhibitors generate about $14 billion per year in revenue, with about 30% of that amount being driven by public interest in big cats. Because the number of exhibitors that would fail to be exempted from the prohibitions is uncertain, CBO cannot estimate the amount of foregone revenue attributable to lower attendance because big cats were no longer on display. We expect those lost revenues would occur over an extended period of time as the population of big cats shrinks. Howie's rebuttal was, it is incorrect that licensed zoos would not be able to replace their big cats who pass away. Only unlicensed private pet owners who do not exhibit to the public would not be able to replace their animals. All zoos open to the public must have a USDA Class C exhibitor's license. Absolutely no USDA licensed zoo would fail to be exempted if they simply comply with the law and do not allow public contact. They are all exempt. They would all be able to breed and replace their animals or require more, i.e. continue exhibiting big cats. CBO report said, CBO has no data about the physical characteristics of the exhibition settings for big cats, the ability of currently licensed exhibitors to meet the new setback and barrier requirements, or the number of exhibitors that would need to develop a conservation plan. Thus, CBO is not able to estimate the costs of those requirements. Howie responded, there is no issue of not being able to meet these requirements. All zoos licensed by USDA already have to meet current USDA requirements for cages. None have to build any new barrier. The setback requires no expense or challenge to meet. It only applies if they exhibit the animal outside of its cage. If the animal is not in a cage, such as out on a leash, it simply must be kept 15 feet away from the public for safety. There is no cost at all to this, just diligence in keeping the animal a safe distance from the public. The CBO report said, in order to qualify for an exemption under the bill, wildlife sanctuaries would be prohibited from transporting and displaying their big cats outside of the sanctuary. CBO has no data on the number of sanctuaries that display big cats or the revenue associated with that activity, and thus cannot estimate the cost of that prohibition. Howie answered, by definition, true sanctuaries do not take big cats off-site for display. This is simply part of the usual definition of a sanctuary and not a burden of any kind to any sanctuary. The CBO report said, for all other entities, H.R. 1380 would require people or organizations who own big cats born before enactment to register the animals with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. CBO cannot estimate the cost of the mandate because regulations implementing the bill, including the cost to register the animals, have not been developed, and the number of animals that would need to be registered is unknown. Howie responded, per the notes above, it is important to qualify this statement to be clear that only owners not licensed by USDA, i.e., private pet owners, must register their animals. Registering the animals owned by unlicensed individuals is necessary in order to enforce the law, i.e., know if they violate the law by breeding or acquiring more. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service just needs to know what animals they own at the inception of the law, and this registration takes place only one time. It is not an ongoing activity. As noted above, this could be done via a simple database with an online data entry form. It is true that there is only anecdotal evidence of how many of these animals there are. The best guess is there are a few thousand big cats owned by less than 1,000 individuals, a very small database. The CBO report said, finally, the bill would prohibit those owners from breeding the cats. Approximately 200 cubs are sold each year at roughly $8,000 per animal, according to industry sources. Many of those cubs are born in facilities that would be unable to continue breeding big cats. CBO estimates the cost that breeding prohibition would be less than $1.6 million per year. Howard's answer was, after talking to representatives of the organization that will not be named, who spoke with CBO, I believe this incorrect information was simply a result of a misunderstanding from that conversation. A few years ago, in preparing information for a USDA petition, we estimated the number of cubs being bred each year for cub petting. The half-dozen major exhibitor breeders tending to have in the range of 8 to 12 cubs at any one time, and given the cubs can only be used for a few months before they are too large to pet, And adding the few dozen lower volume exhibitors, we estimated about 200 cubs born each year. But that estimate was not of how many are sold. It is how many are born at the cub petting zoos, primarily to be used in their own cub petting operations. As discussed above, before the 2016 rescission of the generic tiger rule, tiger cubs could be sold without a captive bred wildlife permit. The other listed species required a permit, so we did see some sales of tiger cubs prior to 2016. Since then, we have seen no legal sales for cub petting. There is evidence of exhibitors evading the law by falsely claiming a transfer of a cub as a donation and being paid cash, as evidenced in the recent trial of Joseph Maldonado that included 12 convictions for exactly that. While the price of a cub now is moot, given that there are no legal sales, the price quoted of $8,000 as an average is incorrect. The most valuable cub would be a white cub due to the rarity, and one that is only a few weeks old, so it has a few months of petting left. The one sale I have a written record for was $5,000, and that is the number we generally would hear about for this most valuable of cubs. Very young golden cubs were talked about being worth $1,000 to $2,000 and quickly drop in value to zero once they are too big to pet. The publication Animal Finder's Guide, where people used to advertise cubs until the publication shut down about a year ago, would show cubs for sale for just hundreds of dollars or available to be given away at no cost. But again, the value is not relevant because there are no legal sales among cub petting zoos in recent years. And if he had not gotten that, well, I don't know, I think I talk about this later, but the CBO reversed their report and they brought it in under the threshold. And if that had not happened, the bill would never pass. If you're enjoying my diary, please like, share, and subscribe. You can find other ways to connect to me over at bigcatrescue.org/Carole.Baskin.